Hi people! In this video we're gonna look over the different talent choices you have as a discipline priest. I'll compare my choices with what most guides are saying, and in the cases where we don't agree, I'll go through why I've made that decision that I've made. In most cases I will agree with the guides, and in those cases I'll try to not just repeat what the guides say, but actually tell you something you maybe didn't already know. And so let's get into the talents. On the first row, the choice is pretty easy. You pick between increasing the strength of Penance by 25%, that's both damage and healing, or you pick the damage and healing buff for 10 seconds whenever you heal someone below 35%, or Schism for the increased damage window. In Mythic Plus, the 20% increase to all healing and damage is way better than the 25% increase to only Penance. Although you will only have the Twist of Fate buff when someone is healed below 35%, it still outperforms castigations when just averaging things out in some mythic dungeons. Also, Twist of Fate can really help you save lives, so in the end it's a pretty easy pick. In raids, however, almost all healing is done by ramping up huge spirit shells, in which case the on-demand 25% damage increase works out much better. For the second row, you pick your only mobility talents. If you play Curian and went with Masochism, you'll have 0 mobility abilities, you'll be just like a snail. Now, mobility can really save lives, meaning it should be prioritized over Masochism, despite the fact that Masochism is a minor healing increase. Picking between Feathers and Body of Souls, I'd recommend the Feathers. Applying Body and Soul will cost 1.5k mana, and the feathers are free. Also, feathers can be placed on the ground for several minutes and then be used when needed. You can even have 3 feathers on the ground and 3 charges ready. Overall, feathers seems to give you the more options and it's free, which is why I'd recommend it, as would probably all other guides recommend you to do. Next up comes the Mana Regeneration row. The first ability is trash in all ways. 0.5% of your total mana is 250, which is about 1/6 of what your power word shield costs. Also, the shield has to be fully consumed. Maybe if you spam shield on the tank as often as you could, it might be worth it, but the playstyle itself isn't worth it. So anyway, picking Mindblender replaces Shadow Fiend. Both have their attack speed increased by haste. Mindbender has a 1-minute cooldown and it lasts for 12 seconds. Each of its attacks restores 0.5% of your total mana. The standard attack speed, I believe, is 1.5 seconds. Me myself, I got a 10 attacks during a 12-second window, so a 1.2 seconds attack speed. The same length as the cast time of, for example, Smite and Shadowmend, and also what I believe to be my global cooldown. Anyway, with this attack speed, that means that the Mindbender gave me a total of 5% mana per minute, and it also did an average of 100 DPS, and it can heal through Atonement. Power Word Solace is an instant free cast which restores 1% mana. Its base cooldown is 15 seconds, affected by haste. For me, the cooldown is about 13 seconds, so about 4.6% mana per minute. If you didn't pick Mindbender, you also have Shadow Fiend. If that's because you picked Shield Discipline, then you're bad. Shadow Fiend gives you a 1% mana per attack, lasts 15 seconds and has a cooldown of 3 minutes. For me, it does about 10k damage during those 15 seconds and about 12 attacks. Therefore, it gives me about 4.3% mana per minute. So, picking Solace gives you a potential 8.9% mana per minute, meanwhile Mindbender gives you a 5% mana per minute. As a comparison, Spiritual Potion, Mana Potion that is, gives you 2.4% mana per minute, or 12% mana with a 5-minute cooldown. A Shadow Fiend is basically a Mana Potion. In Mythic Plus, you should grab Solace. It'll give you more damage and more mana. However, Mindbender's 1-minute cooldown is just as long as the Spirit Shell's 1-minute cooldown. The 6 to 7k damage from Mindbender will be a great addition to the shields, which is why you in a raid should pick Mindbender, despite the fact that it will give you less DPS overall and less mana restoration. Row 4 is just crowd control row. Dominant Mind allows you to use your mind-controlled mob like a pet, and it is the only damage or healing increase you'll find here, as you can use the enemy mob to heal or deal damage. It can be really useful. The big downside is that if you're AoEing down a big pack, then your mind-controlled target will likely remain at full health when the rest of the mob dies, so you'll have to single target that dude instead. Psychic Voice reduces the cooldown on Psychic Scream by 30 seconds. You don't use that spell that often, although you do use it sometimes, so I wouldn't consider that that cooldown reduction to be worth it. Shining Force pushes people away, like 25 yards away. It's pretty useful for a Sanguine week, but you should avoid pushing mobs into other packs. If you have aggro, you should just fade instead. In raids, your choice doesn't really matter, and Mythic Plus it might. I'd recommend Shining Force for Sanguine weeks, otherwise just use Mind Control. And I also think that Sanguine returns every 4 weeks, just to make it even more interesting. Anyway, in the 5th row, most guides recommend Sins of the Many, and I do not fully agree. It increases your damage by 12%, diminished depending on the number of active atonements you have. At 5 atonements, it's reduced down to 6%. At 10 atonements, I believe it's reduced down to 3%. Therefore, in raids, when it comes to the Spirit Shell, the effect is really minor. In a dungeon, it only increases your atonement healing, which usually makes up about 1/5 to 1/4 of all healing done, depending on key. Castigation increases the total healing done from Penance by about 10% per atoned target. It's spread out, however. It's kinda fun, but it's not very useful. Usually when you have many targets atoned, you want to use a lot of damaging spell instead of using Penance as a healing spell. It does, of course, have synergy with Castigation. The final talent in this row is Shadow Covenant, which instantly, on a 30 seconds cooldown, does a number of things. 1. It heals 4 players and yourself within 30 yards for about 2.5k damage. Or healing, I mean. And this healing is increased by Atonement Mastery. Secondly, it increases all shadow damage and healing done for the next 9 seconds by 25%. And thirdly, it locks you to only use shadow spells for those 9 seconds. This can be a major cooldown, especially in Mythic Plus. Sometimes you have to resort to Shadowman spamming, and whenever that is the case, Shadow Covenant is amazing. It's a big AoE heal that's more mana efficient than Radiance and almost as strong. It will be slightly weaker if you have taken the Conduit, otherwise it will be stronger. And then the fact that it also increases the healing by Shadowman by 25%, it's just good. With Atonement and Shadow Covenant, my Mence heals for about 8k on a 1.2 seconds cast time. That's about 6.6k HPS, and then add in some juicy 16k crits for even more healing. I find that there's really only one big downside to this. You cannot dispel when Shadow Covenant is active. You also can get yourself locked out of both Shadow and Holy during certain Mythic Plus weeks, but that's not really hard to avoid. I averaged things out, and I found that Shadow Covenant increased my total healing by about 16% in Spires of Ascension plus 14. I found Sins of the Many to have been about a 3% total healing increase by looking at the Atonement healing and how much it would have been increased. Therefore, I recommend Shadow Covenant and Mythic Pluses, not only because it on average will give you more healing, but because it also gives you a strong healing cooldown that you otherwise wouldn't have had. Now what about raids? Well, like I said, often Sins of the Many will only be about a 3% increase for the Spirit Shell ramp up. If you ever need to spam some Shadowmans, or just want to do some pretty good AoE heal instantly, you would prefer Shadow Covenant, so I'd recommend it for raiding as well. When deciding a damaging spell, we get to choose between upgrading our dots, getting a Divine Star, or a big circle. We'll simply use the tooltip numbers and assume we're gonna hit a single target, and then we can do some calculations. Purge the Wicked does 18% more DPS than Shadow Word Pain. Divine Star does twice as much DPS as Halo and 258% of the HPS that Halo does. Not only does Divine Star do more healing and damage compared to Halo, it can also be used without the risk of pulling everything within a 30 yards radius. Most guides are gonna say Purge the Wicked, but I really have to say Divine Star. Divine Star fires a light projectile that travels 30 yards forward, hits everything in its path, and either heals or deals damage, and then returns to you, yet again hitting everything, and yet again healing or dealing damage. The star has about a 3 to 4 yard radius, and you can hit mobs even though the graphic didn't even nudge them. It'll always hit yourself, both moving away and coming back. And supposing you have a tank and one melee, and you hit them as well, it wins in healing done. Often you can hit quite a lot of players in Mythic Plus with it. I often use it as a damage spell, but you could also use it in a more healing oriented way. And even if I wouldn't want to hit the tank and the melee DPS and myself, I often do so, regardless. Penance will apply Purge the Wicked to a nearby target if it hits a target that has Purge the Wicked active already. The issue, however, is that if you need to use Purge the Wicked to heal a player, then you only have a 2 seconds window to reapply Purge the Wicked again, using Penance before the dot wears off. In a situation where you can almost solely focus on DPSing, you will also be able to use Shadow Word Pain and Divine Star, and the combination of those two will out DPS Purge the Wicked. In almost all fights in Castle Netheria, there are soaks or other types of stacks mechanics, which makes Divine Star very suitable. If nothing else, you will always have melee and tank stacked. Because of all of these things, meaning the good healing, the good DPS, and the fact that you'll often be able to hit quite a lot of people, I'd recommend Divine Star in both Mythic Plus and Raiding. The final row is rather fast to go through. You usually don't want to lose Rupture for Spirit Shells in Mythic Plus, therefore you decide between Lenience and Evangelism. Although good, you might not have too many good opportunities for Evangelism, which means you might as well go for Lenience for the 3% damage reduction on targets with atonements. In a Mists of Turna Scythe plus 15, it did the equivalent of 84 HPS on the tank. It can, however, technically also save lives. If a spell or attack would do exactly 100% of your health, and you had Atonement from a Lenience Priest active, it would instead do 97% of your health, which would keep you alive, at least for now. Evangelism is likely the strongest choice. I don't use it much, however. Most guides would recommend you to either pick Lenience or to tell you to choose between Lenience and Evangelism, and I would say the latter. So in the end, the difference isn't huge. Part of the reasons why there even is a difference between what I would prefer and what some of the guides are saying is because I mainly look at healing done and look at DPS in second hand. Stronger heals means more global cooldowns freed up for damaging spells, and it will always be better to keep a majority of the players alive than just to do some more DPS. So that's why I believe that you should value healing more. You are, after all, a healer. Anyway, here's a recap. For rating, I would go with 3, 3, 2, and in this row just pick whatever you want, 3, 2, 2. And for Mythic Plus, 2, 3, 3, 2 or 3 on this row, and then 3, 2, 1 or 3. I hope you found this helpful and maybe learned something new. Don't forget to subscribe and like. I'll be back soon with another video, and until then, see ya!